This is the Comics Alternative, episode 249, reviews of Reich, The American Way, Those Above and Those Below, number 1, and Time and Vine, number 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week we're going to be looking at three recent, I guess we can call them recent, all of them, titles. We're going to begin with the 12-issue series by Elijah Brubaker, Reich. After that, we're going to look at the first issue of John Ridley and George Jeanty's The American Way, Those Above and Those Below. And then we're going to wrap up with Time and Vine, number 1 by Thom Zahler. But before we get to those titles, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off the cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, and the three works we're talking about on today's episode, you can find the latest issues of those on dcbservice.com, including the final issue of Elijah Brubaker's Reich, issue number 12, and the third issues of The American Way and Time and Vine. And in addition, for 40% off, you can get the trade paperback, the 10th anniversary trade paperback of the original American Way series. So if you like what you hear today, you can check those things out at dcbservice.com.
That's right. Every month they have incredible specials, the specials of the titles that we discuss, and many, many, many more. Go to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So, Andy, here we are in the middle of summer. Are things going okay for you?
Yeah, I think so. Summer's going by fast, but I've been trying to enjoy it. How about you?
Yeah, I guess the same. The fast part especially, and what's been making things go quickly for me is I'm preparing for a move. So pretty soon I will be down toward your way, living and not just visiting.
Yeah, so you'll be in the Charlotte area, and I noticed you're changing your address with the publisher, so it's good that you're on that.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that sooner rather than later because I don't want Amanda to have to forward me things over the next month or so. But, that's a big pain. But other than that, I'm trying to enjoy what I can of the summer.
Yeah, so anybody listening right now who has something to send Derek, like gifts of food, muffins, comics, hate mail, know that he has a new address, and you need to actually find out what that is before you do.
Right. Contact me via email, and I'll let you know what that is. Or if you want to get on my bad side, then send me something really big and awkward at my Texas address, and I'll have to forward it.
Yep.
Well, let's get into this week's discussion, and we're going to begin with Reich by Elijah Brubaker. And, I said at the top of the show that we're looking at three recent or somewhat recent titles. And, with Reich, that's the iffy part. It's not really recent because this original 12-issue run began in 2007 and ran to 2014, at least according to the publication information in each of the issues. And it's published by Sparkplug Comics, which I guess is no more. And the thing that's kind of iffy about this, and Andy and I were discussing this right before we turned on the mics, these were published by Sparkplug and made available, but I would guess not widely available. And beginning last year, Mark Arsenault with Alternative Comics and the consortium that he has helped to bring about has been distributing Reich. And so for the past, I guess, year now, we've had an issue of Reich solicited, and I guess every issue of the monthly previews catalog. And in fact, issue number 12 is solicited in this month's previews.
Yeah, so if anybody missed the original publication of Reich from 2007 to 2014, Alternative Comics is the place to go to get the series now.
That's right. And we do want to thank Mark Arsenault for sending both me and Andy the entire run of Reich. I know that we were interested in this title, and we were thinking about discussing this once that 12th issue came out. But Mark had them on hand, and he said, I'll send them to you. You guys can begin discussing this in July. And here we are, discussing the entire run of Reich. Now, Andy, had you read any of the Reichs when they originally came out about 10 years ago now?
No, I hadn't. This was my first exposure to it, and I was really glad I got a chance to read it. Yeah,
I have the first 3 issues when they came out in 2007, I guess maybe to 2008 and 2009. But then after that, I didn't get any more. And I don't know exactly why that is. Wherever I was getting it, and I can't remember where, maybe didn't carry issues 4 and on. Who knows? Mm-hmm. But I didn't even know that things had completed until, I guess, last year we saw something about Reich issue number 1 being resolicited, this time through Alternative Comics. So now it gets a second life through wider distribution, and I would recommend people pick it up, whether they know anything about Wilhelm Reich or not, whether they have any interest in the history of psychology or psychoanalysis or psychology histories and systems. This is really an interesting read.
Yeah. And it's, I'm always impressed by creators who take on these long-term multi-year projects. And, in a lot of ways, Reich reminded me a little bit of Jason Lutz's Berlin.
Yeah.
Not just because it's this kind of auteurist project that takes years to produce, but also because they're, at least for the first half of Reich, it deals with a very similar time period and, part of European history.
Yeah. What did you know of the historical figure Wilhelm Reich before reading this biography?
Not a thing. How about you?
I knew some. As an undergraduate, I double majored in English and psychology, but psychology was my real passion, at least in undergraduate school. And I thought that I would go on to graduate school in clinical psychology. I had an intense interest in the history of clinical psychology, histories and systems, and personality psychology. And that's where I got quite I'd say a large dose, not really large, but I think a healthy amount of history when it came to Freud and the history of psychoanalysis. And so those who were contemporaries of Freud, those who came after Freud, those who broke from Freud, and those histories really fascinated me. So, for instance, the relationship between Carl Jung and Freud and their break, I was really interested in this. I didn't know as much about the relationship between Reich and Freud as I did between Jung and Freud, but I knew about that. So I knew about the where Reich was coming from. I know about him being ostracized. I know about the orgone, and I know the kind of weird, almost pseudoscience aspect of his work that I think Brubaker really teases out well in this 12-issue series. So I knew something about Reich, but not the fine detail of his life.
So for those readers who aren't familiar with, or those listeners who aren't familiar with Reich, how would you kind of summarize his life, or the way the way Brubaker at the very least approaches his life?
He's someone who in the early part of the 20th century was one of the acolytes of Sigmund Freud. He was drawn to Freud's work. He was kind of a shining star, but a bit controversial, and not just because of his ideas, but also because of his personality. He's someone who tended to rub some people the wrong way because of his aggressive personality. And what he's primarily known for is an emphasis on sex, and not sex in a Freudian sense, in terms of the libido as the driving force of the psyche, of the unconscious, but in terms of, I guess, the physical, biological aspects of sex. And so where Freud was talking about sex as in kind of an abstract way of how people become the way that they are in terms of the unconscious, neuroses and whatnot, with Reich, it's the way that I always understood it is that he actualized his theories through the biology. So, for instance, and we get this in Brubaker's story, that the analysis or the therapy did include the physical body, and there would be nakedness, there would be touching, and this is, I think, where a lot of people were a little uncomfortable with Reich and his theories, both at the time and even later. And they thought of him as almost something like a physician sex pervert in a way. And I remember even as an undergraduate, I thought that he got a bad rap for that. I mean, whether you agree with his ideas or not, they were definitely ahead of their time. And in reading about Reich after Brubaker's biography, I saw that there are some who did see him as kind of a harbinger of the sexual revolution, right? That hit in the 1960s, and this is someone who died in the 1950s in prison. Because of his ideas were ahead of their time in terms of sexual liberation. And one of the great things about Brubaker's biography is he really fleshes out those ideas in ways that I wasn't aware. So, for instance, Reich was someone who tended to meld psychoanalysis and Marxism, which is also something that made him a controversial figure, especially at the time. But in addition to that, he used his emphasis in these areas, in leftist politics and psychoanalysis, to help those who were underprivileged. And so one of the things we learn in Brubaker's biography is that he worked in clinics to provide free medical care for those who were poor, who were underprivileged, and to help them open up sexually, because it was his belief that it was part of what caused neuroses in individuals were the strictures that culture put on individuals and the limitations of limiting free expression, sexual, physical self-expression. And another thing that made him controversial, he even took this practice to teenagers, right? And so he was a proponent for people younger having sexual experiences, which definitely put him out of not only the mainstream, but also in terms of the psychoanalytic community at the time.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So what you described there focuses largely on the first 6 issues.
The first part of his, I guess the first half of his life.
Yeah. And the first 6 issues of the series. And then, for issue 7 through 12, Brubaker gives us Reich's life in America, as we see him at the end of issue 6 or so, that he's leaving. He's leaving to go to escape to Norway from the Nazis, and then it jumps to this time after the war, when he has been kind of settled into the U.S., though he had been there for a few years.
Yes, and it's that latter part of Reich's life that I really wasn't that familiar with. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is when we get an emphasis on his theories of orgone, but other than that, I really didn't know much. And so in this biography, we learn about his belief in UFOs and his run-in with the U.S. government, the Food and Drug Administration, because of the orgone cabinets that he constructed. And so that's one thing that I really did appreciate about this, is that it took the biography looked at Reich for the first half of the run. I guess in those things that really put him on the map in terms of the history of psychology and science. And then when things get a little wacky, I guess is one way of putting it, and he was discredited in so many ways in so many people's eyes. That's what we have in the second half of the book, or the series. And I'm glad that you mentioned the first 6 issues and then the second 6 issues. I think that Elijah Brubaker does a pretty good job of evenly dividing those parts of Reich's life, the pre-United States and then the post. And he does so, the first 6 issues and the last 6 issues. In the 7th issue, I don't know if you had this feeling, but in the 7th issue of Reich, when I first read it, it struck me as unusual. Mm-hmm. And it threw me for a moment, and I had to even go back and make sure that I picked up issue 7 and not accidentally picked up issue 10 or 9. And because what Brubaker does is it's almost like a fast forward, right? The very first page of issue 7 takes place in Arizona in 1954. So by this point, not only has Reich already come to the United States, but he has moved a few times. So now we see him in Arizona, and his youngest child, his son, is playing with another boy, and they're playing yo-yos, which explains the image of the yo-yo on the front cover, which confused me at first. And then almost the entire issue is taken up with the relationship of the boy and his friend talking in a way that serves as exposition, right? So it kind of serves as a way of filling in the gap over, I guess, not quite a 10-year period of what has been happening to some degree with Reich and his family after coming to the United States. And then we see an older Reich taking his son out to eat and talking with him about a number of things, including sex. And then the very end of issue 7, and this is on the inside back cover, Brubaker writes a little message that says that this particular issue seemed difficult for him to write. Apparently he was going through some things personally as well. And so this, as I guess about a halfway point, issue number 7, was rather apropos, not only in terms of the story of Reich's life, but also in the way that Brubaker is telling his story. Because it does seem to be a marked difference from issue 7 on. And this may have had something to do with whatever Brubaker, the creator, was going through at the time.
Yeah. The style changes dramatically. Mm-hmm. And I kind of chalked that up maybe partially to what you're describing, but also because the early issues that are taking place in Europe have a kind of German expressionistic quality to them. Right. Very angular, and darkly shaded, kind of geometrical shapes, lots of, that. And, and it's especially noticeable in noses that the characters have, which are almost, perfect triangles very often. And these enormous round eyes that some characters have, is all, again, all remind me of German Expressionism. And then when we get to the United States, and Reich himself is much larger. And in fact, the earlier ways figures were drawn, they also had like enormous heads and small bodies. And then it gets closer to a naturalistic look, not being completely naturalistic. And Reich himself is bigger, and he looks a lot different.
Right.
So it's the transition there that he makes, and I think that Brubaker makes, and I think you're right to point to issue 7 as being an interesting way to approach that transition, because we really don't see Reich himself until the end of that issue. That Brubaker's made this dramatic. And so it's not only a big time jump for the character, but there's a dramatic stylistic shift as well. I'm not sure if that shift corresponds to some other kind of, art style that would have been popular in the US in the 40s and 50s, the way, the 20s and 30s is drawn in the earlier issues.
Yeah, and I like the way that you were describing the differences in Brubaker's style in the first 6 issues that takes place in Europe versus the last 6 issues in the United States. Expressionistic, I think, is apt. I was going to use a description that's probably much lamer than that. I was going to call it gothic cute.
Gothic cute. That's
yeah, and what I mean by, I was thinking about that. You mentioned the large heads, especially the big eyes, and there's something about the characters. I think a lot of the characters, but some in particular. There's one, one of the affairs that Wilhelm Reich has early on, and we see her in the first issue, is Leah Lasky. And she's always shown with these larger eyes. But again, with the big head and the smaller body, it just strikes me as something akin to, what is that comic? Lenora, I can't remember the title of that book.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's somewhat like that. So there's something kind of gothic to this, but I think expressionistic is much more accurate. There are much more dark tones in the first 6 issues, a lot of more black, significantly more than in the part of the biography that takes place in the United States. Also, a lot more detailed in terms of the line work, and a rougher line work. When we get to the last 6 issues of this run, the line work has a smoother, cleaner feel to it. And it's more iconic than it is, or is simple, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, than the first 6 issues, which have a more detailed scratchiness almost to them. And I think that gets to the expressionistic or gothic element that we've been describing.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of really interesting artistic choices that Brubaker makes throughout the series. I think pretty consistently he uses a 6-panel grid on every page, at least as far as I can remember, and I think that functions pretty well for this type of narrative as well.
Yeah. It would be interesting if we were ever to talk with Brubaker on the show to ask him if the change in art style was a conscious decision or if it was something that just evolved and he didn't realize it at the time.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to mention too about that the 6-panel grid is that at the end of issue 1, he does acknowledge Chester Brown's influence, and so I wonder if he doesn't mention that Chester Brown's style choice like that or layout choice might have influenced him, but it definitely does seem like if he's indebted to Chester Brown and specifically Louis Riel, then this definitely might be the case with him. He also mentions that he uses notes in a way of following Chester Brown. And it's the notes were one thing that I did want to comment on, because I really liked the notes. I found them really useful. What the notes were doing was basically acknowledging or citing some references, giving some additional information, especially about characters that we may meet only briefly, elaborating on what the secondary sources say about a particular subject, but also acknowledging areas where he took creative license. Mm-hmm. And it seems like that latter part ends up being the cause for the demise of these notes, because I think it's after issue 7 or so, they stop, or issue 8, they stop. And he says in the final issue that he decided to stop doing the notes because people were accusing him of fictionalizing too much. And so I was actually a little disappointed that those notes stopped, because there were places when I got to those last few issues where I was kind of counting on being able to look at the last page of the book and find notes that might explain something, and they weren't there anymore.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the notes. You're right. That is one connection he makes to Chester Brown, in particular Louis Riel. Ultimately, I wish that there had been notes throughout, because like you, I found them very helpful. The lazy part of me, though, when I got to issue 6 and didn't see any notes, I thought, okay, so I don't have to keep going back and forth as I'm reading the narrative, right? Although it's definitely worth the effort to get that context. What are some of the secondary sources regarding Reich? How do they explain things? And, what might Brubaker be doing in terms of taking some creative liberties, which he would tell us about every now and again in the notes. And so I wish more had been there, because I found myself missing them when they weren't. Now, we do get notes in the first 5 issues of the series. In issue 6, there are no notes. And then in issue 7, we get notes. But then I think with no, we don't get it in issue 7, but we do get them on issue 8. But then I think that's the last time we do see any notes. And so they're there, they're gone, they come back, but then he decides to leave the notes aside. And you're right, in that final issue that is, again, just solicited in this month's previews. So many of our listeners who are keeping up with Reich may not even have seen this yet. He does explain, Brubaker does explain why he did what he did in terms of easing back on the notes. And I can see why he's doing that, although I did find them useful.
Yeah. But I've been thinking back too on your description of Reich's life, especially as it's reflected in this series. One of the things I really appreciate that Brubaker does, and I think this is sort of connected to when he talks about getting rid of the notes too, because he's making Reich out to be a complicated figure when I think for the most part he has tended to be, at least from the sound of things, either dismissed or demonized. I mean, the last half of the book, those last, decade and a half or so that he's in the United States, he does seem relatively unsympathetic. I mean, he's got these pretty outrageous theories about this orgone energy. He creates machines that are supposed to collect the energy, or these boxes. He creates cloud busters that are supposed to make rain. And he has, as you mentioned, this UFO stuff, but he also has these run-ins with the government, that ultimately result in his downfall. And also that he has, he treats the people in his life pretty terribly. his wives, his mistresses, and his children in particular. But what's interesting is how you describe too that this in his early life, he is a really complicated figure. He's, again, you mentioned like the kind of charitable work he does and the clinics, these free clinics that he runs. And that's all really admirable, but he's also, again, he's pretty terrible to, especially the women in his life. And among other things. And so it's nice to see that Brubaker isn't necessarily engaged in some kind of recuperation activity where he wants to reject all of the kind of negative historical views of Reich, but so he doesn't go too far in the direction of kind of recuperating him too much, but he does give us a sense of a figure who is a very complicated person. And so he is not, and he says this even at the end, that he's trying not to make someone seem, especially with those beliefs he has later in life, to be completely insane. There's something more going on there. And I think part of that complexity is shown towards the end of the series when Reich gets multiple psychiatric evaluations as a part of his sentencing, following these trials he has with the U.S. government, that they come to different conclusions about his mental state.
Right.
And that seems to, that seems to indicate even later in life when it seems like it would be easy to dismiss has this, borderline, cult leader, and scientific crackpot that, even in his time, people couldn't quite, nail him down.
Yeah. And the phrase nailing him down, I think that's apropos. I said earlier that I knew a little bit about the early life of Wilhelm Reich, and not so much about his later life, especially when he was in the United States. And I think that after reading this series, that seems to come through. In other words, in looking at these 12 issues of Reich, Brubaker does a great job of highlighting in the first half of this series those parts of Reich's life that could possibly, not definitively, but could possibly explain the complications of his character that you mentioned. So, for instance, his past when he was a kid, the relationship between his parents, the things that he witnessed, all of that. Even in issue number 4, we get this, what will be a formative moment for him and his wife, Annie. Annie Reich was also a psychoanalyst, a fairly famous psychoanalyst. When they were living in Berlin, they were a part of a very violent protest, or they witnessed the violent protest, and that was a formative moment for Reich in that he committed himself to leftist causes for a while after that. So in other words, in the first half of this series, in Reich's early life, we can see things in more detail that kind of explain why he's the man he seems to be. But things become much more enigmatic in Reich's life in the United States. Why does he believe, as you said, crackpot theories? And a lot of people would call these, I would call them crackpot theories, where he's trying to wed this idea or orgone, which is kind of strange and abstract in and of itself. But when you bring that together with UFOs and the kind of energy, which I've always looked at as kind of a negative orgone, what he describes as DOR, and I can't remember what that stands for, but it is almost like a radiated orgone. It's like a negative orgone that's supposed to cause ill health, bad things to happen. And it's not just in our lives. He thought of it as a force kind of like orgone throughout the universe. And so when he used his what's called cloudbuster machine, right, to try to influence the weather, he's pulling those negative energies that he believed UFOs brought with them, from the air, in order to not only take care of really nasty storms, hurricanes, and whatnot, but also to bring a more healthful life to his environment. Now, again, all of this stuff seems really wacky. We don't have those moments in the last half of this series in Reich's life in the United States to explain what brought this on. And, I'm left to feel that, maybe this is just something physiological that's going on, psychological, that he's just losing touch, or he's starting to, for whatever psychosomatic, physiological, neurological reasons, really believing these things, and he's losing touch with reality. But it's not, his behavior isn't explained in ways that it is in the first half of the series through, his childhood, the protests, the relationships that he has. I mean, those kind of things go a long way of explaining, why he may be the guy that he is and his beliefs. But the latter half of his life, when things get really strange, it's hard to put your finger on why he's doing or feeling the way that he is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that I think gets to something I wanted to mention with that gap that happens between issues 6 and 7, because it does seem to be that whatever happens between the time he leaves, where is he leaving? Is he in Berlin or Prague? I can't remember where he is.
He's in Scandinavia. I think he's in Sweden, isn't he, before he comes to the United States?
Right. But before he goes to Norway, he's in
Norway. Yeah.
He's in where is he in Prague or Berlin? I can't remember. Anyway, going basically from, trying to escape the Axis powers. He goes to Norway. Something happens where he has, a kind of run in with the press there that makes him, that discredits him and kind of causes him to have to flee Norway. So there's something that happens between issues 6 and 7 in here, right, in his life. And issue 8 does go back to 1941, because we get that interesting testimony from Albert Einstein saying he tested the orgone machines and there was nothing there. But anyway, that whatever this movement he has from his study of sex in Europe to believing orgone is this force, this energy that exists and controls so many things. Whatever that transition is skipped over in this series. Because I'm assuming it happens somewhere in that gap between when he's in Norway and he gets discredited and he makes his way to the U.S.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned the beginning of, or you mentioned issue 8. In the beginning of the issue 8, we get one of these testimonials that you had mentioned, like we have later with Albert Einstein, with his second wife, Ilse. I find it interesting that in another thing that's missing in this biography, in terms of that Norway experience, in Norway, I think, if I remember correctly, is when Reich was really close to and living with Elsa, E-L-S-E, or A, not Ilse, who became his second wife, I-L-S-E. And as Brubaker points out, Reich even considered Elsa a second wife, even though he never married her. But then we don't know exactly what happened to that relationship, because when we get to the beginning of issue 8, after Reich is entering the United States, or around that time, he has met Ilse, who will become his second wife, his actual second wife. So there's something else that's missing about Reich's life in Norway surrounding his relationship with Elsa, whom we're introduced to earlier, but we're not given that much information about who she is in that relationship. So maybe, with Brubaker as this comics biographer, that's just a part of his life he didn't have near as much access to.
Yeah, I mean, that could be it. I'm not sure what kind of information is available out there about Reich, but I'm also wondering if if the choice, because the division is so neatly split between the first 6 issues and the last 6 issues, if it doesn't make sense, structurally to focus those last 6 issues on this later period, and kind of even leaving out the transition, and so that it becomes such a much more dramatic break.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
And that he's built a character, in those first 6 issues who's, I wouldn't say sympathetic, but not completely unsympathetic.
Right.
Part of what I think is interesting about him is that the way he treats other people, the terrible way in which he especially treats women, but also some of the ways in which he treats his children, get some explanation. It is either, it is partially due to his own upbringing and the horrible way in which his father treated his mother and treated him. But it's also that a part of his basic understanding or opinion or feeling or whatever about sex makes him kind of an emotionally cold person to these women, and allows him to justify multiple infidelities because he doesn't buy into the conventional morality of monogamy. And so those around, it does seem to be kind of indifferent to those around him who are suffering because of his decisions.
Right. Yeah. And I think that first tragedy in terms of his relationship with women appears in this first issue of the series. Mm-hmm. And this is with a woman who first is a patient of his, Laura, not his younger daughter who is named Laura, but Laura, who's a patient, and he gets pregnant, and then, according to this biography, convinces her to have an abortion. By some accounts, some believe that Reich himself, even as a physician, attempted this abortion. It went wrong, and this lover of his died. And so, yeah, he does come across as, at least in this case, very unsympathetic, cold and detached with the women in his life. And we see his character in both halves of this series, right? In his pre and then post United States stay. We see it play out over the course of his day-to-day lives, although there are parts like the Einstein section and like that Ilsa section that we mentioned where you'll get these testimonials. And for instance, and these run throughout the series. The first time we see this is in the very first issue when a character, Greta Luren Bibring, gives us, and we're not even sure who this character is, but we see her set against, again, we have a 6-panel grid, and she's in a black panel, and it's just her and her word balloons. And she's telling us, the reader, a little bit about what's going on with Reich at this time. And we get these testimonials throughout the series. I really like these. On the one hand, it reminded me of what we see in Warren Beatty's Reds. Those pauses in the history, in this case a biography, where you get people who maybe are a part of the story or know something about the story, just approach us momentarily as readers and tell us a little bit about what's going on. But in terms of comics, it also reminded me of Ho-Che Anderson's King, because we get a lot of that as well. Yeah. Something very similar. And I think, and I haven't looked at King in a long time, but it may be something like a 6-panel layout where we have characters against a dark background telling us about what was going on with Martin Luther King in his life at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good reference, or both of those are good references. Mm-hmm. When we got these 12 issues, which was kind of interesting because I had ordered the issues through DCB service when I saw them first show up from Alternative Comics. So I had been reading it as it went along, and then getting the package from from Alternative Comics to that contained all 12 issues was pretty exciting. And then, kind of tore through the whole series all at once. It's a really fascinating series. It makes me want to learn more about Reich, but I think Brubaker does a great job in this series of kind of revealing a complex historical figure who's, and the big challenge of doing so is that, it would be very easy in those last 6 issues, especially, to kind of make him to be a foolish and ridiculous character. And he doesn't go that route. And so I think making Reich such a complicated figure was a big challenge. And I think Brubaker met that challenge well, but also it's a engrossing and interesting narrative. And also, I really appreciate, Brubaker's style throughout this series. I really love his art, and I'm looking forward to his next stuff coming out.
Yeah, I am too. And I also like the fact that it is a comics biography about a historical figure that you wouldn't think would be the subject of a comic book or a graphic novel. The vast majority of comics biographies are from these almost larger-than-life characters, right? I mentioned Martin Luther King, but you also have Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, those kind of individuals. Even we had something not too long ago from Self-Made Hero on Audubon, right? But all of these characters, are more or less, very significant. Their names are very prominent, whether we know a lot about them or not. Reich's not that way at all. You ask the everyday, common, educated individual, who was Wilhelm Reich, and they'll say, who? I would guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I think in that way, it's comparable to Joe Ullman's The Abominable Mr. Seabrook.
Good comparison.
Taking a figure who was probably well known in his time, especially, and who's been kind of lost to history, but also who had this a very similar career arc as well, even though in different fields.
And sex was involved.
Yeah, and sex was involved. I'm tempted when you said what you just said about this being not a common subject for a comics biography, to hand these 12 issues over to some of my colleagues in psychology, and saying, hey, do you want to read a comic book about Wilhelm Reich? Especially my colleagues who teach like abnormal psychology and stuff like that, or who teach human sexuality, I should say. I think that would be interesting to see what their response would be.
Yeah, ask them and say, hey, would you teach this in class? You want to move on to the next title we're going to be looking at this week?
Yeah.
And this is The American Way, Those Above and Those Below, issue number 1. This is written by John Ridley with art by George Jeanty. Danny Mickey is the inker and Nick Filardi is the colorist. So this is a follow-up to the original American Way title that was an 8-issue series in 2006 that came out from Wildstorm. But this is Vertigo, this new series.
Right. And it seems like that's, other than the Wildstorm series that Warren Ellis is writing right now, that seems to be the place where a lot of the creator-owned stuff, at least from Vertigo, or excuse me, from Wildstorm, has ended up in Vertigo.
Right. Now, you read The American Way, the original, correct?
Yes, a long time ago.
Yeah, same here. And we were discussing this earlier today before we started to record this episode. I intentionally didn't go back to look at my trade of the original American Way before I read this first issue of the new series, Those Above and Those Below, because I wanted to get a feel, because I couldn't remember much about the original. It'd been so long, and I wanted to see if reading this first issue, if I would be completely lost or if I would get the sense that this is something that someone unfamiliar with the original Wildstorm series could jump on and understand and appreciate it. And I think that's the case. I think it does help to have read or know something at least about the original The American Way series from 2008. But if readers have never seen that, don't know anything about it, I think that they could jump onto this new, I guess, I don't know, do we know how many issues this is going to be?
6.
6? Okay. This 6-issue miniseries. Did you get the same feeling?
I did. I think that there isn't a ton of exposition in this book, which I also found interesting. But I do think that maybe a reader's experience would be enhanced by reading or having known the original American Way series. But I honestly, I was like you, I don't remember that much of it when I got into it this time. And, it does, it does seem to stand on its own. We do know that, that something happened in the past that, 10 years prior to the series starting. And so the series starts when in 1972. So
yes.
in the early,
this
late
new
50s.
one. Yeah.
Yeah. So the previous series covered the 1950s and early 1960s.
Or the 60s. Yeah. Right around the time that Kennedy took office.
Right. And so, we do get some mentions as to this disaster that happened in the past that caused basically the end of costume superheroes. And so we pick up here in particular with 3 different characters, from that original series.
Right.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah. No, these 3 characters, there's Jason Fisher, Missy Devereaux, and Amber Eaton. And Jason Fisher was the New American in the original. And then Missy Devereaux was Ole Miss, one of the Southern, I guess, prefab, if we want to call them heroes from the original American Way. And then Amber Eaton was the hero Amber Waves.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So all 3 were kind of patriotic heroes in some way, shape, or form, though representing really kind of different aspects of America pretty clearly. And so we pick up with the first character. Was it Travis? No, Jason. Excuse me,
Jason Fisher. Yeah,
Jason Fisher, who is still fighting crime, but what's kind of interesting is that he is fighting crime in a way that isn't necessarily embraced by everyone. Now, one of the twists of the original series was that we find out that the New American is African American, and that's a big cause of some of the conflict in that series. But here he is fighting, an African American gang that is basically killing drug dealers, stealing their money, and taking over their territory in Baltimore. Many are questioning why Jason isn't just going after, why is he going after black criminals? Why isn't he going after the white criminals who are causing problems too? And then with Missy Devereaux, she's married to the governor of Mississippi, and she is being talked into possibly running for governor herself when her husband's term limits are up. And finally, Amber Eaton is kind of an urban terrorist in the kind of the weathermen mode.
Yeah.
And she's involved in a group, this kind of underground group like that. So we get several different aspects of what was going on in 1972. What we're probably going to see is some of the Southern strategy, right? Continuing that was going on at the time to kind of separate the South politically from the North and the West. And then, some of the racial unrest that was, lingering after continuing to linger after the end of the 1960s, and finally the political unrest, especially with the kind of often student run underground, homegrown terrorist organizations.
Right. And I think it's really interesting that Amber Eaton, who was Amber Waves as a hero, is the one who's a part of this Weathermen-like organization, because she was one of those who seemed to be kind of idealistic, patriotic in the original American way, if I remember correctly. I really do I think of all these three characters that you've highlighted, the one that stands out in this first issue, it seems to be Jason Fisher, because I think he gets more panel space and more page space than the other two. He also stands out to me because I think that Ridley and Jeanty, they complicate him in ways, or his situation in ways that weren't as complicated in the original The American Way, because as you described it, Jason is stuck between that proverbial rock and a hard place, right? He is ostracized by those who are white because he is black, and especially at this time, but he's also ostracized by the black community because of what you had mentioned, him choosing to fight black drug dealers and not whites who are causing the injustice that in a variety of different ways help to create this kind of drug culture in the African-American community. But what Jason Fisher does is he chooses to fight these drug dealers because he feels they do more harm to the black community directly than others. And so he goes after them, even though he gets hell for doing so, because as one character puts it, I think his brother, when people see you standing alongside a white policeman, that's not good. And his brother is someone who is more a part of like the Black Panther movement, right? You mentioned the underground, the Weathermen links here in this first issue. We also have Black Panther emphasis here as well with Jason and his context. So I think that they've made it really interesting. What is Fisher going to do in terms of fighting crime? And the decisions that he makes is going to make life much more difficult for him than it would be otherwise.
Right. Yeah. I think that when the original American Way came out, it came out at a time when there were a lot of other creators doing kind of similar things with superhero analogs. We had stuff that Mark Miller was doing in The Authority,
right?
That Warren Ellis was doing in a variety of things, including Planetary, and and in several other places, and those two also coming out of Wildstorm as well. And so I think that Ridley and Jeanty's work might have gotten kind of buried in that 10 years ago, because there were so many other things going on, but they were doing very interesting things that others weren't really doing, with connecting more deeply connecting superheroes to the politics of the era in which they were created. Whereas, in the 1950s in comics, superheroes were relatively disconnected from the politics of the era. And even when you get into, say, for example, the Marvel Age, it's a few years into the Marvel Age before they start engaging in politics as well. So Ridley is making some interesting historical comments in that First American Way series, not only about American culture, but about the creation of superheroes and race, especially.
Right. And some of the titles that you were mentioning, I couldn't help but think that, the American Way, along with things like The Authority, Planetary, and what have you. These are titles that basically come to the fore or become more prominent in the wake of Watchmen.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not only in the wake of Watchmen, but I think as what that next generation of creators was commenting on Watchmen in a lot of ways.
Right.
So I think now coming out with a new American Way series, I think that the timing is a little better for this, because there isn't a ton of other stuff out there. I think like Black Hammer is probably within that same realm, but still not making the level of kind of political commentary that Ridley wants to make with this. So I'm really interested in seeing. I like Ridley's work, not just as, a comic creator, which isn't a whole lot of stuff, but, his film work, his screenwriting for 12 Years a Slave, as well as his, TV creation of a series like American Crime. The commentary he's going to be making on in that early 1970s period, I think is going to be really fascinating with this series as it is set up so far.
Right. And, one of the things we haven't mentioned in terms of the original American Way, and, you're right, it is heavily invested in the politics of the time that it came out, but also the politics of the story context, which is the 1960s, especially the early 1960s. But something we haven't mentioned is the fact that it also is centered around this fabrication of the superhero. Now, there are some heroes that are a part of the American Way that seem to be legitimately heroic, right? In fact, there are even some that they're not exactly sure where they came from. So you mentioned a lot of these are analogs. Now, in the American Way, Pharaohs is like the Superman figure, right? And he does seem to have legitimate powers. Same thing with Freya, who's the Wonder Woman analog, and she does even mention that she is a myth, right? But then we have someone who is called the Wanderer, who I guess is the Martian Manhunter, but he is a character that we're told multiple times is definitely a fabrication, right? And so what we learn in the original American Way is that the American government, beginning in the early days of the Cold War, felt that they needed to create this, with everything seeming to go wrong, right? With Russia or the Soviet Union sending a satellite up ahead of us, acquiring the atomic technology, race relations in the United States going so bad, they needed to give Americans something hopeful. And so they created the, what was it called? The Civil Defense Corps,
right,
and which included all of these characters. And some seemed to have legitimate superpowers, and others were just completely fictional and made up. And this is the result of government agencies that made sure that these true and also fake characters got a lot of attention, that also played up the publicity of this in order to give Americans a sense of safety, but also a feeling of supremacy. Now, I'm wondering how this part of the original American Way is going to be coming out in the later issues of this new 6-issue miniseries, Those Above and Those Below, because unless I'm forgetting something, this really didn't get much, if any, mention in this first issue, right? The fake, false sense that we get of the original with the Civil Defense Corps.
Well, there is the character that that comes up towards the end. If I'm kind of getting what you're saying, right? That
this new issue,
that Amber is talking to a potential recruit for her organization, who points out that her father was
that's right,
was the Red Terror, and that was, as she says, he was paid by the U.S. government to create this Cold War superhero narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so her whole mission, her name's Nikki Lau, her whole mission with joining this organization is to do more to correct the wrongs that the government created through their fake superhero conflicts.
Yeah, you're right. I had overlooked that. Toward the end of this first issue, Those Above and Those Below, when she says about her father, Johnny Lau was my father. The government paid him to play the Red Terror in those bullshit public fights you all put on. Mm-hmm. And I think that's about the only reference that is made to the falsity of this Civil Defense Corps in the originally American way. Although it doesn't go into too much detail, right? Because Johnny Lau as the Red Terror could have had certain powers, and I'd even forgotten about the Red Terror, and then going back to read, I didn't reread all of the original American way, but I read about a third of it. But yeah, Lau is one of those as the Red Terror who has no powers whatsoever. And in fact, the story surrounding him is really horrible. Mm-hmm. So when his daughter alludes to this at the end of this first issue of American Way, Those Above and Those Below, I mean, this is where I guess a knowledge of the first American Way, maybe not 100% necessary, but I think it would help in understanding the larger context here. Yeah.
But it also answers your question as to that they are going to be dealing with that
right.
That has not, the effects of that have not gone away. Now I'm wondering too, are we going to see analogs in this series for like Watergate, and stuff like that too, as well, since we're dealing with that period in history.
Yeah. Good point.
But anyway,
also very timely for our times.
Yeah, exactly. Which, and that's when I was reading this, I felt that as well, that Ridley's not only dealing with 1972, he's dealing with 2017.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think, one question I had when I first saw this solicited was, why bring this back? And at the time I was thinking, well, there are several other Wildstorm properties that are coming back in some form or another. So I just thought it was, one of those. And so it was working in that trend. But there may be something a little more politically immediate to this new miniseries.
Yeah. And, I would think with John Ridley coming off his, Oscar win for best screenplay and, with 12 Years a Slave, can get all the work he needs, so doing a comic book isn't probably, he's not doing this out of necessity, but I think that there is, there's definitely something very worthwhile about this project. So I'm glad that, of the many things he could probably be doing right now, he's chosen to bring back this series as well.
Right. And I am glad that it is a Vertigo series, because you and I have mentioned several times on the podcast that, we're both, historically speaking, fans of Vertigo, although lately, I guess over the past several years, they seem to have, I don't want to say floundered, but it's been a challenge for them to find a direction, even a raison d'etre, right? If, in a larger sense, because I just feel that after Fables, what was their flagship title? You really can't point to anything, whereas you could before, for the most part. And this that's not to say that there haven't been over the past few years really good titles coming out of Vertigo. It's just nothing that is sustaining. So this, I'm hoping, is a shining example of what we can get from Vertigo still.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and I think, Vertigo is probably going to be a combination of what we used to know Vertigo to be, but also what, the role Wildstorm served at TC as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the final title that we're looking at for this week, and this is Thom Zahler's Time and Vine, issue number 1. And this is the first, at least, print comic that Thom Zahler has done since 2005's Long Distance. Mm-hmm. And, I had the opportunity to speak with Tom at HeroesCon last month, and he was telling me a little bit about Time and Vine. The issue hadn't come out, of course, at that point, but he was kind of whetting our appetite. If our listeners want to listen to that brief conversation, go back a few weeks to one of the recordings we made at HeroesCon, where I'm talking with a number of people from Artist Alley. So this is kind of a different title for him. If we look at Loving Capes, that was an interesting, kind of romantic in many ways take on the superhero genre. Then in Long Distance, that was definitely a romance story, or you can call it a romantic comedy if you want. I don't know if the romantic element will come through in Time and Vine. I don't think that it's prominent in this first issue, but, I didn't necessarily expect that to be. It's a very different kind of premise.
Well, I saw more consistency with this book and Zahler's past work. I do think that there is definitely going to be a romantic element to this, maybe even something of a romantic comedy, even though we do have also some kind of more serious romantic issues going on with the main characters. But to kind of set up the premise, Time and Vine involves this interesting winery in upstate New York that's run by a character named Jack Cadell. And he, and what makes this winery interesting is that he has a magical wine cellar. And if you go into that wine cellar and drink wine from a certain year, you're able to go back in time to that year. And he meets a young woman named Megan Howe, who
in contemporary times.
Yeah. In 2017, who's at a party, is having a party with some friends at the winery, but she's not really enjoying herself. And they get to talking, and he decides to show her how the winery works. And so they go back to 1917 and then later to 1969. And so, one of the reasons why I said that I see consistency here with this is that I think Thom Zahler is one of the rare comics creators who can do these romantic stories well. Long Distance, I think, is a really good example of the type of romantic comedy he can do. I think, Love and Capes is great in merging superheroes and romantic comedy genres. Of the other creators, I can think of like Jamie Rich, for example, who's an editor at Marvel now, who writes some pretty good romantic comedies. There's a handful of others. So there isn't a lot of this in comics. But he takes a basic kind of supernatural premise, one of the things I really like about this issue too is that he lays out the rules for the time travel pretty well, without having to go into a lot of elaborate explanation as to why it happens.
Right.
We don't need to know why there's a magic wine cellar in this winery. You just
take it as a given.
Yeah, it's there, and you don't need to have the that part of the story told. But there are rules here. For example, when you leave the wine cellar, it'll give you clothes. It'll put clothes on you basically for the era that you're in. There's something to do with the way other people see you,
right?
That
Facial
are native
obfuscation,
to the time.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there's those kinds of rules, but otherwise you don't need a lot of explanation because that'll get in the way of the story itself, which I think is a fun and interesting idea here about about time travel, about what we're probably going to see some things to do with Jack's past relationships that are haunting him, as well as how Megan's going to deal with her ability now to time travel and what she's going to do with it. Mm-hmm. And if that's going to have a romantic element to it as well, which it may very well, because we start to see hints of that here.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you pointed out that Zahler does a really good and I think clean and easy job of laying down the ground rules of this magical wine cellar, but doing so in a way that is very straightforward. And at the same time, I would say that in doing so, he kind of eliminates any potential complication that could come up from this premise. So, for instance, you can't. Another one of the ground rules, so to speak, is that you can't bring anything back with you. Right. So when they go to 1917 and then 1969 later in this first issue, and we should mention that this is a long first issue. Mm-hmm. This is 40-some pages of comics, so you definitely get your money's worth here. There's a lot of story. But when they come back, they can't take anything with them. Also, as Jack tells Megan, you can't really change history. So, I mean, right there, that eliminates what you would have with, let's say, Ray Bradbury's The Distant Sound of Thunder, right? Stepping on a butterfly and causing irreparable changes to the timeline, historical timeline. That's not an issue, because that would make things not only more complicated, but it would take Zahler's story in a direction that he probably wouldn't even want to go to begin with. So it maybe leaves him more time to focus on the relationship. Now, it's interesting that you see this within the context of a romantic comedy. I guess I can see this. It's different from Loving Capes and Definitely Long Distance in that I don't see where our two main players, right, Jack and Megan, are going to be romantically involved. But with at least Jack, we see at the end of this first issue that there is a past with the woman who eventually becomes his wife, and we're introduced to her when they travel back to 1969, and Megan notices that there's something about that woman that's significant to Jack, and we learn a little bit about that relationship in this first issue, and I guess with the other, this is going to be a 4-issue miniseries?
Is it? I don't know.
I'm not sure. But for this miniseries, however long it is, then we're going to learn more about that relationship. So I guess with Jack, that may be where the romance comes in, right? Of his relationship with a woman that he had once been connected to and then married to, even though now that relationship is no more. But there's also the relationship that Megan has with her mother. And I think Megan as a character, the way that Zahler sets her up, I mean, she's perfect for this premise in that she's a history teacher. So, going back in time is like candy to her because she wants to be not only study history, but as she tells Jack, she wants to experience history, right? To live parts of it. And so this gives her that opportunity. But also her mother is suffering from Alzheimer's, or I guess this is the early onset of Alzheimer's. And so it's rather interesting and ironic that she becomes aware of this magical winery that allows people to go back. And that's not that different from remembering back. And where her mother, because of her slow onset of Alzheimer's, is no longer able to mentally go back in time anymore in the ways that she could. So I think that unless there's a romantic relationship that Megan will become a part of in the later issues, it just seems from this first issue that Megan's relationship, in addition to Jack, which seems to be platonic, is going to be with her mother.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's interesting because, I saw the connection of Alzheimer's and time travel to be really interesting because there's the one exchange with her mother where her mother says something about, how, are you glad school's coming to an end? And Megan thinks she means the current school year that she's teaching, but the mother actually means that Megan's about to graduate. So so there is a way in which that is a sort of time travel, right? Mm-hmm. That, and it's not just that her mother can't go back to certain memories, but that she, literally believes she is in a past that she doesn't realize is the past.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that because, I had described the Alzheimer's as the inability to, so to speak, time travel. But the way that you're framing this is almost as if the mother's condition is an inadvertent kind of time traveling, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I love that scene that you just described because I had to go back and reread that middle panel on that page when the mother tells Megan this. And I noticed and appreciated the subtleness that Zahler did in writing that, right? Because I think if you read this first issue quickly, you would miss the fact that the mother is having a slip and seeing her daughter, because of the Alzheimer's, as back in college momentarily, forgetting that, she has graduated and she is a history teacher. So she, when she talks about the school year, it's from a teacher's perspective, not a student's. But the way that it's presented and the dialogue at this point between Megan and her mother, it may be easy to overlook that if you don't read carefully.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm looking too more at the scenes in when we're talking about kind of romance, the scenes in which, in 1916, we've been saying 1917, but it's 1916.
1916.
That Megan ends up getting into a little flirtation that even leads to a kiss with this James Aston.
New Year's Eve.
Yeah, at the New Year's Eve party. And so I'm wondering as if, maybe we'll see her return to 1916, 1917 and reconnect with James, or that she may be getting into a bunch of different romantic entanglements through her time travel. Well, meanwhile, Jack has this much more serious situation going on where he has these run-ins with his, I guess his wife, who, they had a pretty tragic relationship and that he has a lot of regrets about. So that's not necessarily a romantic comedy kind of element, but I'm hoping in a sense that the seriousness of that is going to be tempered by Megan kind of getting herself into these situations like she does with this James Aston in this issue. So that she will be exploring her relationship with her mother in some cases, but also maybe something else going on.
Right. Yeah. And we'll see in the next issue or two if Megan becomes involved in some way with the character during one of these wine travels. The situation with Jack and the woman who will eventually become his wife, Teresa, is really interesting because that adds another complication to the premise. Because the way that Jack describes it to Megan when they travel back through the wine to 1969, he says that because Megan recognizes this woman, Teresa, and that's when Jack said, well, yeah, she will eventually become my wife. And you did see her back in 1916 at that New Year's Eve party. because different travelers can see one another if they're traveling during the same time. So we don't know exactly what has happened with Teresa. I mean, I just assume that, she's dead, but there's something that's going on here. I mean, they're definitely not married anymore, or they're not together, but apparently from the way that Jack is describing it, Teresa is traveling in some ways at the same time that Jack and Megan are, because we see Teresa in 1916, we see her in 1969, and they're crossing paths. So I'm going to be curious to see in the future issues how this path crossing is possible within the time-traveling parameters that Thom Zahler has laid out.
Well, he does explain that Teresa has gone back to 1916 to kind of deal with a problem in her and Jack's relationship when Jack goes to Vietnam. And so the 1969 scene, that's not her traveling anymore. She is present, in that period. That is, when she's around to host this moon landing party that they go to watch. And that's when after that, Jack explains to Megan just kind of what happened with their relationship and, why it's so hard for him to go back to certain times.
Right. But I mean, that's what I find interesting, and I want to learn more about in the next several issues, is how the paths crossing, how Teresa and Jack's path crossing during these different time travels are possible, because it's obvious that both Jack and his soon-to-be, or former, however you want to describe this, wife, are sipping wine and time traveling at the same time. So it's as if one person's travel has imprinted, almost like a palimpsest, right? A particular moment in time that another traveler, Jack in this case, drinking the wine, going back to that time, experiences the original moments as well as the imprint of a previous traveler, which is a different twist to the time travel narrative.
Right.
And so I think that that's where a lot of the romance, the Zahler spin of romance will come with Time and Vine. And also it's a very clever title.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to this. I mean, I think that there's I mentioned Zahler being one of the few creators now who does these romantic stories really well. But I think one of the things that or a couple of things that I really appreciated about Time and Vine, and is one that it is a pretty high concept time travel story. I mean, you can pretty much explain how it works very quickly, as we did. But also that he does these really engaging, fun, nice stories that don't have a lot of comparisons in other comics. And I feel like Time and Vine is a type of comic that you could give to somebody who's not a comic reader, and they would appreciate it, because first of all, it's got a very clear hook, but it also can reveal to them that what they think a comic isn't, that the normal kind of preconception of comics as being kind of superhero stories or whatever aren't here, but it's still a really engaging and interesting and valuable comic, partially because it adds some diversity to the types of comics that we have out there.
Exactly. And on top of everything you said, Zahler is a very good storyteller.
Yes.
He's someone, I think, that just a lot of people either don't know about or may even overlook, which is a shame.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of his great strengths too is dialogue. I just love the way these characters talk to each other. I love the way that Jack and Megan immediately connect, that they have a conversation. Their initial conversation is really realistic in the way that two people might meet, and that Jack could find in Megan almost immediately someone he's going to trust with the secret. Plus, then how their relationship develops over the course of this issue, so that he not only is trusting her with this secret, but is opening up to her about his, the pains of his past relationship with this Teresa, and how, they end up becoming kind of partners in some enterprise that we're going to find out about later on.
Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned the dialogue in this title. And I think in all of Zahler's comics, there is something, I guess, Aaron Sorkin-ish about Thom Zahler's writing. And I don't mean that the characters speak in the same way. What I mean by that comment is that with an Aaron Sorkin project, you can tell that by the way that people talk, it's Sorkin, and there's something unique about the way that he writes dialogue. In a similar way, but a different kind of dialogue style, you can read a Zahler comic, and if you didn't know that it was Zahler, so for instance, if someone didn't even know who Thom Zahler was, and they picked up Love and Capes and Long Distance, and now this first issue of Time and Vine, they could say, okay, even if, let's say, the art was obscured, they could tell that the same person wrote this, right? That this is the same creator just because of the way that the people speak. In other words, there is a Zahler style, a Zahler stamp when it comes to, definitely the art, but also in terms of character and the way that the characters speak.
Yep, exactly.
So, 3 great titles that Andy and I discussed this week. We started off with Elijah Brubaker's Reich, the 12-issue biography of Wilhelm Reich. After that, we looked at issue number 1 of John Ridley and George Jeanty's The American Way, those above and those below. And then we concluded with Time and Vine number 1 from Thom Zahler, an IDW comic.
Yeah, so 3 great and very different and diverse titles that we looked at this week.
Yes, and if you want to find great prices on these and other titles, then check out Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, and there you're going to find great discounts on the latest issues of all the titles that we discussed this week and many, many others. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right, or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com, and you can also find us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And you can also check out our Twitter feed, which is @2guyswithphds.
That's right, but you can also find us elsewhere on social media, such as on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us, let us know how we're doing, and find out what we're doing.
That's right. And we'll be back with more comics to discuss next week. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.
What happened?